Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to today's very important event on the new tariffs announced by the United States on Chinese-made electrical vehicles. We are proud to host today's event along with our friends at the Asia Society Policy Institute, who are frequent collaborators with WITA on our events. Before we get to today's discussion, we want to make sure you saw our announcement about a new event we'll be hosting, this time in partnership with the U.S. Council on International Business, to discuss global efforts to create a framework for governance of artificial intelligence. That event will be online on June 5th. Information on that event, including as we confirm additional speakers, can be found at www.wita.org. As you know, if you've watched some of our webinars over the past few years, we like to call out the names of some of those you're in community with on Zoom, even if you can't see them online. So welcome today to Weifeng Zhang with the Chinese mission to the WTO, Ambassador Carla Hills, the former United States Trade Representative, Bill Freimuller with MEMA, the Vehicle Suppliers Association, and Ambassador Peter Allgaier, the former Deputy United States Trade Representative. Welcome, Weifeng, Bill, Ambassadors Hills and Allgaier, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching this on Zoom, you can ask questions of our panelists using the Q&A tab on Zoom. You should have received a copy of today's program by email with a link to our panelist biographies on our website as well. We have a great panel assembled today with some veterans of the WITA webinar platform and a couple new guests. Welcome today to John Bozzella, the President and CEO of the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, Wendy Cutler, Vice President and Managing Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, our co-host for today's event. She's also a longtime collaborator and partner with us, and we're always grateful to have Wendy on. Michael Dunne, the CEO of Dunne Insights and author of the upcoming book that we've all been talking about here for a long time, The Great Car Takeover, China's Master Plan to Dominate the Electric Car Markets Worldwide. I keep waiting for that to come out, Michael. I know it's you're excited about that too, and we're all looking forward to it. Everett Eisenstadt, another old friend, former WITA board member. Everett's a partner in the public policy practice group at Squire Patton Boggs, a former deputy assistant to the president for international economic affairs and deputy director of the National Economic Council at the White House. Glad to have you back, Everett. And we're going to be joined in a few minutes by Hosuk Lee Markurama, director of the European Center for Political Economy. He's going to just be a few minutes late, but hope to be joining us shortly. And our moderator, Jordan Schneider, the founder of the China Talk podcast and newsletter. He's an adjunct fellow of the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for New American Security. Welcome to John, Wendy, Michael, Everett, Hosuk when he joins us, and Jordan. Take us away.
All right, we're going to kick it off with Michael. Let's get a 3-minute 101 on how the Chinese electric vehicle industry became world-beating.
Well, when you think about it, we're in completely new territory. China today has the capacity, the low cost, the supply chains, the subsidies, and the ambition, the likes of which we've never seen before. I mean, previous jolts coming out of Japan and Korea look like kids' play compared to the machinery that China's put in place to compete not only at home, but globally. How did they get there? Your question. I think a key moment in time was late 2014 when Xi Jinping gathered with his lieutenants in Beidaihe and put together what we now know as Made in China 2025. It was a decisive moment because China said, well, we're tired of playing catch up with the West when it comes to cars and internal combustion engines. The way we change this game is to lead in next generation technologies, specifically in electric vehicles and battery supply chains. Well, they went full force, putting billions of dollars behind that effort, hundreds of billions of dollars, actually. And today, what we have is an industry with massive overcapacity and capability up and down the supply chain. And at home, this has ignited price wars. So when I talk to Chinese companies operating inside China, they say, we're dying. We're not making any money at home. We must export or die. And export is exactly what they're doing. They're shipping cars in record numbers. They're the #1 exporter of vehicles globally now. And there's no market that they like to enter more than the US because America is still home to the most lucrative car market in the world. Europe, number 2, isn't even close. So on the one hand, you have massive machinery of an auto industry in China looking for global markets. On the other hand, you have the United States market, very lucrative, but also very vulnerable to this onslaught from the Chinese. That's where we are today. And that's why the Biden administration has put in place these tariffs.
All right. We got a lot of charged words there. Onslaught, and such. Wendy, how did Michael's narrative and the broader rise of the EV industry make Washington feel?
Well, obviously, it's created a lot of angst. And furthermore, it just brings back a movie that many of us have been in before, and many of our industries have been in before, particularly solar. And I think the administration has learned from past efforts that did not materialize, where actions were taken against Chinese imports too late, that our industries had already been injured, and therefore the harm was done and they were not able to recoup. So I find the tariff action, particularly on electric vehicles, to be kind of a new development in trade policy, and that is the United States is putting in basically a preemptive tariff. Now, before the tariff was quadrupled last week, before the president announced it'd be quadrupled, the EV tariff against Chinese imports was 27.5%. That seems quite formidable, but I think Michael would agree that even with that price differential, the Chinese companies still have the capacity and the need to send their vehicles somewhere. So this tariff action, I think, sends a clear signal to China: don't even think about exporting your cars to the United States from China. But I would add that this is not going to be the only policy tool that the United States will use against Chinese potential, that to address our concerns with respect to Chinese electric vehicle production. And that is because the tariffs only affect trade from China to the US. But what we're seeing is that Chinese companies now, car companies, are investing in third markets, including some of our FTA partners, Mexico, and I think, Michael, at our last webinar, you mentioned Morocco as well. But in any event, even with our low MFN tariff of 2.5%, if Chinese companies can go to third countries, even where we don't have an FTA, and meet the looser origin requirements, they could qualify to export to the United States at a lower tariff. So the United States, I believe, and Catherine Tai and others have been clear about this, is basically stay tuned, that the US will be pulling other policy levers to try and address concerns about third country exports from Chinese companies to the United States. So maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah. So, I think we'll come back to the USMCA stuff in a bit, but Everett, I would like to maybe zoom back and look a little more at like the long arc of US trade policy that has brought us to these actions today. So, this 301 investigation was opened feels like a million years ago. What changed over the past few months that led the Biden administration to finally pick up this thread and take some action across a number of different industries?
Well, I think it's a great question. If you go back even than that, the whole auto sector was built on integration just in time, and actually one of the reasons that a lot of the auto manufacturers moved to China was because of the cost, and at that point, China was a magnificent market where they could make a lot of profits. Well, that is completely turned around now, and the profits that are coming out of China are rapidly diminishing. The technology transfers have occurred in a large degree. Now you've got the Chinese domination of the electric vehicle industry and the supply chain. So it's a completely different world than what we had just 10, 15 years ago. And I think President Trump took on China not because of autos, but because he felt that the institutions were not able to discipline a lot of the subsidies and other unfair trading practices that were resulting in overcapacity. I mean, we've had it in steel. Wendy talked about solar. EVs are just another manifestation of that. And I've read some of Michael's recent writings about the capacity of China to provide autos to the world, and they can provide a car they could become and may become the dominant provider of electric vehicles for the entire globe. So I think that the Trump administration may not have started out looking at autos, certainly was concerned about that, but put the 301 tariffs on a broad range of products to try to rebalance the relationship. That has evolved as trade has evolved. And now we're in a situation where the electric vehicles have really become a problem. And for the Biden administration, which really wants to bring electric vehicle manufacturing to the United States, it's a natural outcome that they would try to use these tariffs to insulate the industry, give them time to get up to speed and produce here in the United States, at the same time providing incentives for manufacturing in the United States. And the 301 has some differentiation in timing, and we'll see how that plays out to kind of let some of that play out over time. But it's a story that's being told and is going to continue to be told, but it's not over yet.
So, John, there's an argument which runs basically like the pressure that was put on American car manufacturers in the 70s, 80s, and 90s from Korean and Japanese firms ended up kind of pushing Detroit to up their game and ultimately, turn into much more competitive competitive firms than they would have been had the U.S. not allowed Japanese and Korean firms to build factories in America and build up domestic manufacturing. What is different about this this dynamic today?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are some similarities and some significant differences, but I want to step back before I answer your question directly, because when we think about US and China in the automotive context, it's very complicated. It's not as simple as observers might think. Today, companies in America are building cars made by American workers and exporting them to China. More, in fact, many more, in fact, that come from China to the United States. We enjoy significant trade in components and major chunks of the vehicle that come from China to the United States that support vehicle choice and affordability. And that's been the dynamic. When you think about where we are today, coming back to where Michael and Everett were, China has a 15-year or so head start on transformative technologies and supply chains related to EVs. And that's the dynamic. We are in the midst of a transformation in the United States, and it's going to require hundreds of billions of dollars of capital to make that transformation. And I think the question now is, how does how do policymakers think about the need for a competitive auto industry in the United States? So now let me come back to what the similarities and differences are. Yes, of course, what we've seen over the course of time from Japanese automakers and Korean automakers is companies initially importing into the United States and then putting down roots here, which produces a competitive, vibrant, and innovative auto industry in the United States. Here are some differences. Japan and Korea are allies to the United States. I'm not sure that argument can be made, obviously, with regard to the U.S. and China right now, but that's an argument for policymakers to make, not me. I think the other difference is the extent to which we have seen subsidy and overcapacity in China. And the need to export that. To put some numbers on Michael and Everett's points, I think there's roughly 50 million units of capacity, automaking capacity in China. I think the China market consumes about 30 million units. I think China exports about 5 million units. That leaves about 15 million units of excess capacity that's either going to have to be absorbed in the industry through restructuring, or is going to have to be exported around the world. Those are the dynamics. But I want to come back to another big difference. The world is different today than it was in the 70s and 80s and 90s. Everett talked about the interdependence of the auto industry, a boundaryless, flat world where companies sought low-cost supply chains to support manufacturing around the world. I think the word you could use today is independence, and that independence is the result of a very challenging global environment. And so my last point here is, I think it is important to recognize that there is a need for some time to make sure that the U.S. auto industry, or the industry in the U.S., I should say, is able to be competitive, and that competition it benefits American automaking communities and auto workers.
So continuing to play devil's advocate here, this one for you, Wendy. Like, Jordan Schneider, as a consumer, would love to be able to buy a car for $15,000 cheaper than I could. And I watched the reviews on Billy, just like Michael. These, BYD stuff, they look great. Like, let's set aside the sort of like connected car spying thing for a second. Like, what are how strategic is an auto industry? And is it the sort of thing that, is it the sort of industry that really deserves like both all the IRA subsidies as well as this, the protection that it's currently getting by not having to face off in its home market against the most competitive rival?
Well, absolutely. And I spent a lot of my career negotiating with Japan and Korea on autos. I couldn't agree anymore with John and some of the issues he raised. I would just add one more issue, and we'll probably get into it. One of the solutions, or the accommodations we made with Korea and with Japan, was to encourage investment in the United States by these companies. To the point now, or over for Korea, I think it's over 50% of the Korean auto sales in the US are from US plants, Korean US plants, and Japan even higher. I don't think that option is open for China. I don't think we're going to be inviting EV FDI into the United States. My friend Hosek I'm sure we'll get to this. Europe has a different view on this, but I just want to put that on the table. But just to get to your question, it's short-term versus long-term, right? And so here we really need to think about this. Maybe in the short term, yeah, some of us would like to buy cheaper vehicles, but in doing that, we are basically helping the Chinese automotive industry to become more competitive, which in my mind is only going to undermine the competitiveness of US companies. And we've all seen what dependence on China can lead to for such key and strategic products. And that is, they have no qualms, and we've seen this with their actions against other countries to just hold up shipments. We've seen, announcements of export restrictions, for example, on needed critical minerals. And so as China weaponizes trade more, we need to think a lot more about where we want to be as a country, and do we want to be dependent on an adversary for such key inputs. I would also say, and I don't have the numbers here, but the US automotive industry, not just the finished car industry, represents a sizable part of our GDP and is a critical part of our manufacturing base. And so I think it's critical that we have a vibrant, competitive auto industry. But I also really believe our companies, and US companies now, have a bit of a breathing room with this 100% tariff. And it's really up to them to up their game and, work hard and work quickly to regain their competitiveness and be able to be well placed against their Chinese competitors.
Yeah, I guess my worry is we end up with like Boeing. But anyways, maybe for another time. The awkwardness of this all, right, is batteries. There were some movements towards tariffs on this, but basically the American and like global EV industry for the foreseeable future still is going to need batteries from China. Open question: who wants to jump in on the dynamics there? Maybe host, like, this is your time to say hi.
Hi, Jordan. How are you? Sorry for the late arrival. I'm not sure it's my time to say anything, but like Wendy pointed out, it is indeed true that the Chinese EV makers, at least one of them, which is BYD, has making investments into Europe. And before we draw any premature conclusions, let's be very, very clear that BYD sell about 5,000 cars in Europe, which is in total 0.05% of the European market. We are not afraid. Volkswagen sells about 1 million cars in China. They're the second largest brand in mainland China. And so as for now, the trade-off looks pretty okay. 5,000 cars against 1 million cars over there, that looks pretty okay. But what's perhaps more worrisome is exactly as you pointed out, Jordan. It's we have a dependency on batteries, but we also have indigenous European technology that has been doing quite well. And in addition, you have Japanese manufacturer like Panasonic, and in addition, other local startups that is making really their strides into the European market. So I think the battery investment that we've seen by BYD and also another Chinese company called Cutler in Hungary, some of them are actual real investments. Others are just announced, and the Chinese have Chinese investors have a tendency to make a lot of press releases, but it takes sometimes a while before the money ends up on your bank account. But overall, the investment-driven trade that we have seen in the auto industry is really, really happening in both directions. So on one side, you will have Chinese companies making relatively minor investments into Europe. If you look at the big picture of things, Wendy mentioned the Koreans, and they have been investing, well, I think in total around 10 billion to produce cars in Europe. And my guess is that the Chinese number is for now less than 100 of that number. And in return, we are also investing quite a lot in China from Europe into the Chinese market. And not just because the Chinese market is promising, but also because European auto manufacturers, at least some of them, are adapting to the what I call the Apple model of manufacturing. So basically design, develop, and engineer in Europe, but you basically manufacture using the cluster that you have in Shanghai and other places in order to produce in China and ship it back to Europe. And this is what we've seen, for example, companies like Renault, we have Volkswagen, as I mentioned before, Volvo has been acquired by Geely, and also we have MG, which is a traditional UK brand, has been acquired by SAIC. So if you look actually at the indigenous Chinese brands like BYD and XPeng selling to Europe, we are looking at a few thousand cars per year. And Europe is also, as many know, the European auto industry is the source of the world's largest trade surplus. And if there is an export-led industry, it is Europe. We don't see the European auto manufacturer be shaken by a few dinky cars coming from China that can go 150 kilometers. That's around 120 for you guys on a metric in an imperial system, but we need cars that are basically on the size of Tesla Model Y. That's actually the most popular brand and the make in Europe. And actually, if you take Tesla Model Y, it outsells all the other EVs put together, including Tesla's other models, and they're all made in Shanghai. Unlike Teslas that you have in the United States, that are made in the US, actually Teslas in Europe are actually made in China for quality assurance reasons. Basically, Teslas made in the United States actually don't pass the quality assurance systems in Europe. So there we go.
Just wanted to remind folks that we have a Q&A. Feel free to submit questions and then we can ask them. Also going to open it up to the panelists if anyone wants to ask anyone else on the roundtable a question.
So I want to just jump in here and build on the last couple of comments, and it might lead to maybe even a question of Michael. So you raised, Jordan, the battery question, right? Which is really important and really interesting, right? The tariffs, so far we've been just talking about the finished vehicle tariffs, right? So the 301 tariff, the quadrupling, so 100% for a total of 102.5% on finished vehicles coming from China, finished EVs coming from China. If you look at the tariff codes released yesterday, you got lithium-ion batteries, you've got critical minerals and raw materials that go into those batteries. Some of those tariffs go into effect immediately. And so there is a bit of a challenge here, right, Jordan, that I think is implicit in your question, which is, wait a minute, you've got these finished vehicles, but you've got these inputs that are still that we all around the world still rely on. I mean, you can look at the raw materials and critical minerals associated with batteries, even those produced in the United States, and see an enormous reliance on China for especially processing and refining of those critical minerals. And I think it's important to recognize that the industry in the US is looking to reduce its reliance on China, expand its supply chains to throughout the United States, but also with other allied nations. And so, but that process is going to take some time. So there's a tension in a way built into these tariffs, right? Which is there's an immediate tariff on the finished EVs coming in from China. And I would say that the US is a very similar situation to what Hosek described in the EU. There are very, very, very few, a handful of Polestar branded EVs, Geely's brand built in China coming into the United States, and that's about it. And so it is a kind of a preemptive tariff, as Wendy called it. But the question of what the impacts are of lithium-ion batteries and critical minerals and raw materials is much more complicated. And so I would just finish that by saying it's going to take some time for the shift in those supply chains to happen. And so, Michael, you have a lot of experience there looking at those supply chains, and it took a while for those supply chains and those processing and refining capabilities to build up. And so there's a big advantage there, right? And so it's going to take some time for that to build out across the rest of the world.
Absolutely. China has a lock on battery supply chains, from mining to processing to cell manufacturing. So even if we're building batteries here in the United States, we'll still need to ship some elements to China to be refined and processed. So that's how strong of a leverage China today enjoys. One of the things that's not that well known is that some Chinese battery companies, specifically AESC, are already in the US with battery manufacturing plants in the Southeast. Gotion is also invested. CATL would like to supply Ford. It already supplies Tesla from China. So I sort of anticipate that the future will be one in which the United States ultimately says, we don't have any other way to build out our own supply chains here in the US without participation from the Chinese. And we might even borrow a page from the Chinese playbook and say, absolutely welcome to supply our market with your batteries, but not exported to the United States. You'll need to invest, create jobs, tax revenues. Oh, by the way, we'd also like you to partner with American companies. American company will have majority ownership. China, just like you did in the 90s and 2000s. It's reciprocity time. We need to catch up in batteries and battery supply chains. China's the inevitable path to get there. We can't avoid it. So let's invite them in on terms that are favorable to the US interests and our supply chains. Without doing so, without batteries, we can't really talk about having a competitive EV industry here in the United States. And that bridge means going through China. Like it or not, that's just the reality today.
Yeah, and Jordan, just building on Michael's point, I think it's fascinating because you're almost seeing a reverse tech transfer dynamic where the U.S. industry brought over the auto manufacturing to China, produced vehicles there, and now we're even the way some of the foreign entity of concern rules are set up on the investment incentives is designed to breed manufacturing of battery capacity and technology and know-how into the U.S. economy so we can build up our own ecosystem. So without it, as Michael said, it just can't be done. You've got to have that component here. And just to the point that you asked about Wendy and how vital is it to have an auto industry here, I just want to reflect back on the pandemic, not because it was a great time in any of our lives, but if you recall, it was the auto sector that was called on to produce the ventilators and do a lot of the heavy lifting and industrial capacity needed. And I think there is a recognition, and even in World War II, that you've got to have a good industrial base. You've got to have a trained workforce. You've got to have the capacity to produce machines and the types of things needed in times of crisis. So I think there is another element of the industry to take into account, besides just getting the cheapest product in and the lowest cost and the fastest way possible.
Let's talk a little bit about the Chinese response function for a second. Maybe this is a Wendy and Hosek one. I don't know. How does Beijing feel about all this?
Well, maybe I'll start. Let's just say they were quick to criticize. I think some of the words they used were hypocritical, protectionist, violating the WTO, etc. So we all expected that, right? They also made it clear that they will take countermeasures. And now it's kind of become the speculation game of what will they do. And I think, and this is where I think having Hosek follow me would be great, because when China's thinking about how they're going to respond to the US tariff hikes, the tariff hike on electric vehicles will go into effect on August 1, along with lithium-ion batteries. The EU in a similar time frame is scheduled to make an important decision under its investigation of Chinese subsidies in the electric vehicle industry. So if Europe announces some tariffs as a result of this investigation, China may want to seek a twofer, like, can they hit both of us at the same time and hurt us? But so put that aside for a minute. If you're just looking at the US action, my sense is that China will respond proportionally to the US and will not seek to escalate this, this tit for tat in this sector. That we're in an era now of trying to stabilize relations. If you look at the price tag of this targeted selected package of tariff hikes, the administration has put an $18 billion price tag on this. So I can see China now trying to figure out what package is of products or tariff rate hikes on which products could they do to counter respond to what the United States is doing. But look, it's also possible that they may decide to put in new export restrictions on some key individual critical minerals. They may look to either raise tariffs on imports from the US on autos, which is already at, I think, 40%. Or, they may look to harass our auto companies in China. And also I think they will sue us in the World Trade Organization, but we all know the dispute settlement mechanism is broken, but I think that gives them a perch to further criticize us. So I think we will know soon about how they will respond. They have a lot of tools, but if I had to put my money, I would put it on a proportional tariff hike response.
Jordan, if we're talking about 10 years ago, the US automakers would be much more vulnerable in China, but that's not the case anymore today. In fact, US sales at GM and Ford, Chrysler, Jeep are down by more than 50, 60% since their peak in 2017. Ford is losing money. Jeep's joint venture in China went bankrupt a couple of years ago. GM lost money for the first time in 25 years last quarter in China. So sales are down, profits are way down. There's even some talk about the US automakers leaving the China market because the prospects are so dim there. So in terms of retaliation against US automakers in the Chinese market, that's already, that ship is, no, we're already on our way out. Within 5 years, I expect that the US Detroit 3 will be out of China. So instead, maybe China turns to, oh, you guys want to develop an EV industry. We happen to have a lock on many of the inputs, whether it's graphite or lithium, processed lithium, or something else, rare earths. That may be where they find more leverage, because the story in China is that the Chinese brands are taking over and the Western brands are being shunted aside.
Aside from Tesla, perhaps, which is still doing quite well in China and elsewhere. And it is also a general trend. I mean, I'm not here to defend or accuse the US car industry of anything. I think Americans make great cars, but unfortunately, that's also the general trend of US market shares overseas, even
That's
in
true.
Europe.
May I add, if you look at Hyundai's market share and sales in China, they're the most extreme decline.
True.
They're down by 70, 75%. Everywhere else in the world, Hyundai is killing it in growth and profits, except for China, down by 70%. Volkswagen sales down. Stellantis sales down. Peugeot sales down. Toyota sales down. It's across the board that Western automakers are being sidelined in China. So it's not just a Detroit 3 story.
True. I was actually going to make a small point because I was called out by Wendy about the European measures and retaliation, but indeed, this is indeed a part of the dynamics that we have to look at. One downside of being relatively successful in China, especially for Volkswagen, is that you have much more to lose, which means that there is a collateral damage, and the damage exposure from retaliation is much larger. That's the first point I want to say. And I also want to remind perhaps the audience that the European Commission is about to announce its provisional duties on the basis of countervailing duties against Chinese subsidies, which is a slightly different instrument than the 301s. And this is largely expected on the Wednesday, June the 4th, and June the 5th. And the member states will discuss that proposal. And the number on tariffs against Chinese imports is going to be much lower than the 100% just by the nature of the CVD instrument. But we have already seen signs of retaliation. Chinese have publicly said, well, they haven't publicly linked it, but they have publicly announced that they are investigating French cognac. And it's widely known that the origins of the EU CVD investigation actually comes from France and from President Macron, because of their plan to subsidize consumers' purchase of cars. And no finance minister, treasurer in the world wants to see domestic subsidy going into their consumers, going to foreign exporters. Just that's the nature of things. But we have also seen hints from columnists, trade associations, including the China Chamber of Commerce in Brussels, that issued a letter, and social media profiles, rather than MOFCOM spokesperson coming out and said that there might be some kind of retaliation, up to 25% tariffs on European EVs and autos, and which is a typical Chinese signaling exercise against Paris and Berlin, and letting third parties, well-informed sources, execute that threat is a great way for the government to be able to walk away without appearing like they're succumbing to foreign powers. And one thing that we need to bear in mind here, I think, is that China acts very different towards Europe and Japan than it does to the United States. One thing that you can be very clear of is that China understands real power. And generally, the Chinese public don't accept to be messed around by weaker powers like Europe or Japan or Korea for that matter. Whereas they do respect Americans taking unilateral action. So we are much more exposed, which basically means that we could be looking at a couple of potential outcomes here, and one including a China-EU grand bargain settlement that will involve much larger puzzle with much more many moving parts involving concession and Chinese import. Perhaps we have to remember that China has on a 15% EV tariffs on an MFN basis, and more than just retaliation on cognac. And also, we have to bear in mind that France and China desperately wants to forge stronger industrial partnership in a range of areas, including civil aviation. And coming back to the question about the CVD case and retaliation, I mean, obviously the Chinese are watching very closely. And one of the potential scenarios in order to basically rack up the potential import duties from the European side will be to look at other. Well, when you usually do an anti-subsidy investigation, you look at grants, you look at tax breaks, you look at preferential loan, and typically land use rights. But one of the things that the European Commission could be looking at in order to reach higher range of tariffs up to 25, let's say 40%, they would need to look into inputs like battery, i.e. producer subsidies that go into the companies like CATL, or lithium extraction, or steel and aluminum, and potentially even countervailing against user subsidies. And if you have that process, you can be 100% sure that China will perhaps, well, not perhaps, guaranteed take us to the WTO and probably win.
So we've got a number of questions about Mexico, something Wendy alluded to earlier. Everett, what happens to the USMCA once BYD tries to, or, continues to build up manufacturing there and export into the US?
Yeah, it's almost like Wendy's point about a preemptive tariff. I mean, nothing has really happened yet, but there is such bipartisan concern in the United States that China will invest in third markets that have FTAs with the United States and use that as a platform to export to the United States. And the USMCA is the one at the top of the list. And as you know, Jordan, there's a review clause in the agreement where the entire agreement will be analyzed in 2026, and there will be a discussion about whether to continue it going forward. This auto issue is definitely going to be part of that discussion. The rules of origin in the USMCA are pretty stringent, and I think to meet them, the Chinese would have to invest a significant amount of money and use a significant amount of components to be able to legally import from Mexico. But there's a lot of concern about, trying to use it and doing illegal transshipment. So the investment is being watched very close. In fact, the United States has actually approached the Mexican government, and the Mexican government has agreed not to provide any incentives to Chinese investment into Mexico. So that's one development. Another development is that the U.S. government has talked to the Mexican government about putting in some type of an investment review mechanism based on national security that might mirror our CFIUS review. Mexico doesn't currently have that right now, but that's something under discussion. So there's another component to this that we might be able to get into more deeply, which is the high tech, the autopilot, the data, and which is another concern about Chinese vehicles. There's an executive order put out by the Department of Commerce where they're taking a look at cars and their ability to collect data. That may be another topic that gets discussed under the USMCA. So a lot of the issues that we're talking about today, I think, are going to be propelled forward into that discussion. And those outcomes could lead to impacts in other agreements like Morocco or other markets where China may be seeking to invest.
If I can add there, I think I agree with everything Everett said. I would just remind the viewers that our MFN tariff is really low at 2.5%. So putting aside, the USMCA preference, the notion that like a Chinese companies would invest in Mexico and could avail themselves based on the MFN rule of origin, which is substantial transformation, far less stringent than USMCA, is worrying a lot of folks in Washington and obviously the auto communities around the country. And so my view is like longer term, or maybe not long term, but we're going to need to start thinking about, or we will start thinking about, not just restricting imports based on the origin of the product, but place restrictions on cars coming from, I don't know, Chinese owned, Chinese controlled, based on the nationality of the supplier. That introduces like lots of complications. It's very hard to do, and it's kind of a moving target as well, as many of our export administration folks have learned. When they place Chinese entities on an entity list, 3 weeks later, they're just new entities created. So it's a difficult approach to implement, but I think we may be going there. Everett mentioned the commerce investigation. Depending on the results of that may conclude by saying no Chinese cars will be led in the US due to their data collection capabilities, which threaten our national security. So clearly the administration is looking at a number of different tools. And just this week, Ambassador Tai was, met with the Mexican and Canadian trade ministers, and I suspect that this issue was on the agenda between all three countries, but also bilaterally between the US and Mexico.
Yeah.
Let me also remind everyone, if I may here, say that China also deems personal information and especially geospatial data as extremely sensitive. So if you export autos from Europe, petrol or electric, they actually rips out the modem, the 4G or 5G modem out of these cars, and you have to replace them with Huawei ZTE. And in addition, you have to store all data inside China. Obviously, it is one of the things that China is most sensitive about, because obviously you can use these information to, I don't know, stage a land invasion. I don't know why.
But there are also restrictions, right, on where even Tesla cars can go or drive to, which destinations. And I've heard they're not allowed near Chinese government buildings, state-owned enterprises, as well as, military and other types of installations.
I haven't seen that myself. Considering how many Teslas there are in China, it will be very difficult to enforce, but that's possible.
So Wendy earlier mentioned this idea that the Biden administration isn't like really excited to gear up for a, tit for tat trade escalation like you saw in the early days of the Trump administration. That said, PredictIt gives Trump a 51% chance of being in the White House come January 2025. What would a new president, old new president, potentially do for, I guess, the car industry as well as U.S.-China trade relations more broadly?
All right, so I'm not going to talk about election outcomes. I do think your point about PredictIt, it points out that it's obviously incredibly close. I will just say generally that what we see is, I think, alignment around a couple of key themes. One is the strategic importance of a cutting-edge automotive sector in the United States to U.S. economic and national security. So I think that premise seems to be consistent, at least in my view, when I talk to policymakers on both sides of the aisle. I think back to Wendy's earlier point about the importance of the industry economically. To put numbers to Wendy's point, the automotive industry in the U.S. is approximately 5% of U.S. GDP. It employs across its value chain 9.6 million Americans in literally every state in the country. And what you're seeing now is investments in the new version, the latest version of the auto industry. So I think there's recognition that that's important. Now, to what degree these economic and national security tools are used, I think, is the big question, right? To what degree are they applied more broadly and maybe less in a targeted fashion? To what degree there is a focus more on economic or more on national security tools? And when I say economic tools, those might be tariffs. When I say national security tools, those might be the BIS tools that Everett and Wendy were talking about with regard to the national security implications of connected vehicle technologies. That's really the question. And it's really hard to know at this point because things are changing so dramatically. What specific tools will be used, depending on the electoral outcome.
Anyone else care for some more Trump speculation?
Well, I don't think we need to speculate. Trump has said a few things on auto tariffs already. I mean, he's talked about a 60% just across the board tariff on all Chinese imports. I believe he's also said, someone can correct me, that like Chinese made cars from Mexico are not coming into the United States, full stop. Or maybe he said he put 100% tariff. But I think, he's been pretty clear of his views on this market and the importance of keeping Chinese cars out of the United States.
Yeah, and I think, Wendy, it was actually 200%. So
Yeah, come on.
Sorry.
No, but I think the point, he's been pretty consistent when he says he'll do something. That generally is what happens. There's a lot of cross currents here. I mean, this is such a complex issue, has been pointed out, because you've got the climate elements of the EV transition. You've got the fact that the former president didn't like EVs and doesn't believe in them. A lot of the Republicans, and I think it's important not to discount the Congress here and in this, in what happens on tariffs and what happens on USMCA and what happens in this industry. I mean, there are many in the Congress who weren't happy with the way that the subsidies were rolled out. They didn't like the way the rules were articulated. So it's very tough for an auto manufacturer to know what's coming. And that is very, very scary, because they're putting in a ton of capital to try to meet the needs in a very competitive market with little predictability. And so it's going to be a rough road for a while, regardless whether it's President Trump, reelected, or President Biden's second term. There's just a lot to unpack among tariffs, data, the USMCA, and then the role of Congress. And it's going to come together in 2025, 26. So it's going to be a very, very important year for this sector, and one that deserves very close watching, which we will be doing.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just want to make one more comment based on what Everett said. I think you're right, Everett, that there is, there's a lot of potential risk as well as opportunity, in the intersection between automotive innovation and public policy in the United States. I will say, there is this idea that EVs have become inherently political. Well, for those of us sitting in Washington, D.C., what isn't political? But I will say that what's interesting about this question about EVs in the political context is that it isn't the EVs that are political. It's the idea, the concern that the government is forcing customers in the United States to buy them. Despite whether I need them or not, or want them or not, or have charging infrastructure or not, or can afford them or not. That's really what's happening, I think, in terms of the political dynamics. And so I think as we get past that part of it and get back into, a discussion about the strategic importance of the industry going forward, I think we can get back to focusing on what's important for the country. But right now, yeah, there's not only the uncertainty in the policy space you talked about, but this sort of dynamic about, EVs in the political context, which is, again, I think more about choice than it is about technology.
Closing remarks, Michael.
Yes. So if we talk about tariffs, I think everyone would agree they're best if there's a timeline. We'll set these tariffs up to give our own industry sufficient time to get competitive. But there's some complexity there. Number one, the Detroit 3 in particular make record profits building large SUVs and trucks for North Americans, full stop. That's their business now. They've painted themselves into a corner. So if you're the CEO of GM, you go, I did fabulously well. I took care of shareholders. I made my bonus. What's the problem? What's the urgency? Well, the urgency is that the United States the Detroit Three are no longer globally competitive. They're only winners at home. Secondly, the natural tendency of drivers in the United States is to drive long distances, big rigs at high speeds. This is the opposite of what a battery electric car likes to do. So you have a fundamental sort of exceptionalism in the US industry, and the Detroit Three would say, why do we need to go into electric so quickly? The customer doesn't want it. We're not China, we're not Europe. That's another sort of complexity. And the third one would be, not only are Chinese automakers exporting from China, but also global automakers are making an export base. Tesla exported half of its production from China to world markets. GM now supplies Mexico with virtually all of its products made in China. So the Chevys, I was just down in Mexico last week. The Chevys you see on the road there, they're Chevrolets built in China by GM's joint venture there. So it's one thing to set up the tariffs, but the harder work will be for the Detroit Three and other automakers to say, how do we get globally competitive without going to China ourselves and making that our manufacturing base for the world? It's a huge point in time. Big decisions have to be made. And right now, all the leverage and power seems to be on China's side.
Final thoughts, all of you.
I would just put on the table, and a topic we haven't discussed, but maybe for future webinars, is just the whole issue of overcapacity and the need for kind of international coordination or alignment on responding to overcapacity. I mean, yes, you know, we've gone through it in steel and aluminum and solar, now electric vehicles, batteries. And I think a collective response, I don't mean everyone has to have the same response. Countries will use different tools, but we've already seen, for example, Brazil increasing its tariffs on Chinese electric vehicle imports. We've seen other countries launch anti-dumping, countervailing duty investigations. And I think that just shows this is not a bilateral problem. This is a broader problem. And the Chinese overcapacity and their increased exports are really, you know, extremely trade distorting, particularly given the scale of what they're doing and the international implications. So I think it's important going forward that we do coordinate with our allies and partners. And I'll be looking closely at the G7 meeting next month to see whether collectively what they say about overcapacity and whether they agree to take any unified steps together to address this growing concern.
Yeah, I'll just comment. I mean, I think Wendy hit it right, you know, the nail on the head there. The issue is that how do you discipline a state-driven economy when it has impacts outside its borders, and the overcapacity is not going to go away. And so you're either going to deal with it bilaterally or take every tool you have to try to, you know, mitigate its effects. But trying to get to the root cause is what we should be talking about as well. So I would also encourage a discussion about that is, you know, how do we discipline state-owned enterprises and industrial subsidies in a globalized world, so you don't have these problems and we don't have to deal with them in kind of an ad hoc way, because we really need a better, more cohesive solution.
Yeah, and I would just add, and maybe I'll differ with Michael a little bit on this. The future of the auto industry in the United States and globally is electric, connected, and more automated than it is today. No question about that. And the U.S. absolutely has to be a leader in these transformative technologies. Our economic and national security depends on it. And so this is a competitiveness question, right? And I do think that targeted, time-bound focus on policy to support the U.S. industry's shift and toward more competitiveness is an important consideration at this stage in the industry's development.
Maybe I'll just add very quickly that in Europe we have different reaction in our microcosmos towards this transformation that everybody's talking about. On one side, you have countries like Germany and also Sweden that has embraced a partnership with the Chinese industry, done some extent also knowledge transfer, accepted some investment, but by and large looking to basically take over the Chinese market. And they are all eyeing at collapse of the Chinese overcapacities and hoping to scoop up one of the companies. And this is basically the trajectory that the auto industry have gone across throughout the history. And that's how the transatlantic mergers emerged once upon a time. But I think one thing that we need to bear in mind is that this transformation and this catching up is also threatening the existing dominance of the EU and the US. And this is something that we voluntarily started. We are actually, when we are subsidizing EV purchases because it wins votes in Europe, basically what you're doing is that you are actually helping the Chinese to take over the auto market in the long term, because basically what you're doing is that you're phasing out a technology that Europe and the United States spent 50 years to master. That's a very important point. And what I also see a lot of repeat of the history. I mean, we have struggled with overcapacities here in Europe as well, but in the end, we see a similar preference mismatch between the Chinese domestic market, where we probably won't see a lot of Chinese companies become export competitive simply because they are not accustomed to the ranges, the preference that we have in Europe and United States. And this is exactly the situation we had with Japan as well as Korea back in the 70s and the 80s. And which brings me to my third point, which is about negotiations. Europe is likely to impose a tariff that will be compounded to around somewhere between 25 and 35%. And China has bound rates up to 25% in the WTO on the motor vehicles, which basically means that you are going to have something that comes close to the VER negotiations we had in the beginning of the 90s with Japan. Not so much a V as involuntary, but some kind of export restraint. And they would have to come down on both sides, or we would basically have fragmented markets. And the auto industry is perhaps the most innovative when it comes to both engineering as well as the circumvention. They'll find a way around it. There's no question about that. But the final point I would like to add, which is to Wendy's point about the G7 coordination. I think what we have seen now is that we have engaged in Europe and United States in different kind of user subsidies. And these are basically not enough to attract capital and investment and R&D back to our territories, if you like. This is not enough to win the innovation race against China. So what will actually come next? There will be some kind of probably sustainability-based preferences and perhaps national treatment for chosen countries, partner countries, and non-NT treatment for user subsidies from countries like, for example, China. This is the path that we are probably have to walk down, and it will take 20, 30 years to ride through, just like it took with Korea and Japan. But at that stage, we have to remember electric vehicles is probably just a transitional technology towards hydrogen. And by that time, EVs will be a competitiveness card that China can't play anymore.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation. We've covered so much ground. Honestly, Wendy, we partner on a lot of these events. I think there's probably 20 different topics we've covered here that we could create individual discussions about related to China's EVs, but also rules of origin, subsidies, the multilateral trading system, US-EU relations, EU-China relations. There's literally so much we could cover. We covered so much ground today. Really grateful to all of you. Jordan, thank you for wrangling this amazing and difficult conversation. Really grateful to you. Welcome to the WITA platform. John Bozzella, great to have you back. Thanks so much. Hosuk, thank you for making it work and getting here for us. Michael, always a pleasure to see you. You're the man when it comes to this stuff, and we're all looking to you and looking forward to your book. Everett, always a pleasure to see you, and so glad to have you back on. And Wendy, of course, our partner with ASPI, and you've been terrific with us. We're really grateful to everybody for joining us today. Thank you. This conversation is TBD. There'll be not TBD, to be continued, TBC. So we will be continuing it quite a bit, and we're also going to be doing a lot more on the USMCA review that's coming up. It's going to probably kick off next year, but we're already starting to think about that as well, where a lot of these issues can be addressed. So thank you all. Great conversation. Really appreciate everybody, and everybody take care, and we'll see you soon.